Good evening, everyone. Hello to all of you gathered here tonight. Thank you for braving the cold streets of Winnipeg to join us here. It's delightful that we could gather in person to celebrate this book. I'd also like to extend my thanks and greetings to those of you watching live on YouTube, both right now and in the future. We have a very special evening for you, so I won't take up much of your time as nobody is here to hear from me. So I just have a few very quick housekeeping notes to review, and then we'll move into the actual event that you're all gathered here for. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that the land on which we gather here tonight is Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, McNally Robinson Booksellers itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Rooster Town. And that latter thing is something we're going to be speaking about quite extensively this evening as well. With thanks to Red Deer Press and Fitzhenry and Whiteside, we are gathered here tonight to celebrate the publication of Second Chances by Harriet Zaidman. Just a few very quick housekeeping notes about the procedure here in the space. We do humbly ask that all you in the audience, please keep your masks on over the course of the evening. Those gathered up here at the front will have obviously already removed theirs, and they'll be speaking over the course of the evening comfortably that way. In order to prevent any spread of anything particularly pernicious this evening, when it does come to the Q&A, as it seems perhaps ill-advised to have a variety of people sharing a single microphone, instead what we'll do is ask you to hold up your hand. I will then come to you, ask you to tell me whatever question you might have, and I'll then repeat it into the microphone for the benefit of those gathered here tonight, as well as those watching at home. Because my brain is shot off in a variety of directions and I can't possibly convey the inevitable eloquence of any comments you might have or any very extensive questions, we ask or gently request that you keep your questions fairly succinct, just so I can put them to Harriet. At the close of the event, there will be a signing and you'll have ample time to offer any extensive kind words or further questions you might have to her at that point. You'll hear from me again about signing procedure at the end of the evening, but we'll just ask once this event is through that you all please remain in place, at which point we will transport Harriet to a table beside the cash desk, and I will then let you know when we are set to descend. There is a slight difference in spaces here tonight, which you may notice. So this area is designated a performance space. So as such, we are all gathered here, double vaccinated, wearing our masks and comfortably together. When we leave this area, we will then be entering the retail space of the store. So at that point, we would just ask you to begin to socially distance within the groups that you came. Thank you very much. And you'll hear a lot of those potentially redundant announcements from me once again at the end of the event. But without further ado, let us get to the event itself. Your host for this evening, a great friend of the store, Terry MacLeod, hosts and produces the Prairie Design Lab podcast and hosted CBC Winnipeg's Information Radio and Weekend Morning Show. He received the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal and an Emmy Award nomination. Please join me in heartily welcoming Terry MacLeod.
Thank you so much, John. And thanks to all of you who've come out tonight and filled almost every seat here. We're thrilled that you're here and the opportunity to be exposed to the wonderful ideas of Harriet Zaidman and her intense grasp of an historical period here in Winnipeg that was very, very significant. And the guests that with us that can help to illuminate what was happening then and what's happening now. Dr. Philippe Lagace-Wiens in the middle, and Darrell Sais, whose family comes from Rooster Town. In fact, I visited the little piece of property over beside Phenom Pool with his father and his uncle last fall, and we were discussing what was going on in Rooster Town back up until 1960. I should mention, of course, if you don't know Harriet's work, she writes novels and picture books for kids. The novel we'll discuss tonight is a young adult book called Second Chances from Red Deer Press. It recalls the frightening polio epidemics of the 1950s when children were stricken with paralysis or died from this terrible disease. It also addresses the racism and injustice inflicted on residents of Rooster Town, the Métis community here in Winnipeg. Her middle years novel, City on Strike, also from Red Deer Press, set during the turmoil of the 1919 Winnipeg General Strike. Harriet writes a lot of different kinds of things. She writes articles for The Cottager, for Lake Country Living and Lifestyle magazine, book reviews for CM Canadian Review of Materials and the Winnipeg Free Press. For more than 25 years, she was a teacher-librarian in kindergarten through grade 8 at schools in Winnipeg. She's a mother and a grandmother of 5. Some of the grandchildren are here in the front row. She loves baking, especially bread. She loves to cook. She writes about cooking on her food blog. If you haven't seen it on Facebook, North End Nosh is amazing. And she gives away her recipes with great photographs. She loves to travel. She's a voracious reader, and she's a habitual knitter. Dr. Philippe Lagace-Wiens is an assistant professor who teaches in the Department of Medical Microbiology at the University of Manitoba Medical School. His research interests are, among other things, antibiotic resistance, molecular diagnostics, and treatment of resistant infections. Darrell Sais is an employee of Winnipeg Transit, and he has been for 31 years. He's now the acting operations supervisor and instructor. His parents were residents of the Metis community here of Rooster Town until they were forcibly removed from their home, and the community was demolished in 1960. That removal of the entire Rooster Town community, or Pecan Town, as the Metis people called it, was to make way for the development of Grant Park Shopping Center, Grant Park High School, Pan Pool. Darrell's family and the Rooster Town community are commemorated inside and outside just down the street at the new Bill and Helen Norrie Library. There's lots there to see and learn. Beautiful metal facade on the front of the building with relatives of the Sais family. You can, I stood there with one of their young relatives saying, "That's my grandmother." So that it's quite a lovely place, and the displays inside are pretty special. But let's turn to conversation now. Harriet, why did you write Second Chances?
Oh, well, it's just coincidence. I was having a conversation with Mindy Barsky, who's here today. Mindy's father, for a lot of people who lived in West Kildonan and the North End, her father, Dr. Percy Barsky, was a pediatrician, and he had polio when he was, I think it was 21 or something. It was a young man. And he decided, because of his experience, to become a doctor to help people. But he was left with a limp and his arm was affected. Anyway, she was talking to me about, because I had used some family stories in writing City on Strike, she said, you know, I should write down my family stories. What do you think? And then, you know, we were talking about it. I was encouraging her, because polio, even though her father had recovered and it was all before she was born, certainly affected their family. And he probably died, he died in 1989, he probably died of post-polio syndrome, like it accelerated his death. So she told me some, you know, stories about the struggles, but because he was a very friendly doctor, everybody had nice things to say to him about him and that, and he was always accessible, but it affected his ability to function. Anyway, so a week or two later, I was just sort of standing in my kitchen and I thought, oh my goodness, I should tell a story of how children were affected because by polio, their lives were changed. And the idea of anti-vaccination, like that someone knows better than, and vaccinations are whatever, you know, cause autism, or all the nonsense that has caused this disruption in the delivery of good healthcare to maintain a high level of good health for children and ensure healthy outcomes and healthy lives. That has always bothered me. And you know, one day when I was a teacher, and this was sometime in the 90s, I was walking on playground duty, and a little child attached himself to me, 6 or 7, and he came out with this cough. Like, it was astonishing. Anyway, I said, like, what's wrong? Like, I had never heard a cough like that. He goes, oh, I'm way better. I said, what do you mean you're way better? He said, well, he had whooping cough because his parents didn't give him the vaccination. And he, these are preventable diseases. This child growing up can have lifelong damage to his lungs and his respiratory system. Like, just because of misinformation and disinformation that was spread and maliciously. There's no basis in science for this misinformation. So I thought I should write a novel about that. Anyway, this was before the pandemic, and I finished it before the pandemic began. So it's just coincidence that it that it's come out now.
Sorry, you finished this book before the pandemic?
Yeah, I did. Yeah. It was just coincidence. I pressed send, like the first week into when people were talking about lockdowns, and they were quite happy about it. And then it appeared that the pandemic would last 3 weeks. And I thought, oh, well, it's not gonna, the book's not gonna fly because people will be bored with it because the pandemic will be over. Anyway, it's worked out differently. I'm sorry for the world, but it's worked out differently.
Now we want to give everyone here a flavor of the book, and you've agreed to read what is the first little chapter of the book?
Yeah, it's a short chapter. Okay, chapter 1. In and out, in and out. The air moved at a steady beat. Summoning all his willpower, Dale gritted his jaw and tightened the muscles in his neck as best he could. A jab of pain shot through his throat. Squeezing his eyes shut, he felt warm tears trickling out of the corners, edging slowly along his temples. His willpower, though, was no match for the machine. Dale fought for control, but the pull on his chest was unrelenting. The machine drew life-giving oxygen through the tube, expanding his lungs. A moment later, the pressure was reversed, and he had to expel the carbon dioxide, the process repeating at an even, robot-like rate, the motor vibrating below. The machine didn't care whether he wanted to breathe or not. He was immobile, and he could only assume his arms and hands were lying flat at his side. He didn't know. His legs, which had once propelled him forward at blinding speed, were now useless sticks he couldn't see. He tried moving his head, but got nowhere. A twinge shot through his neck, reminding him of the pipe sticking out below his Adam's apple. That's what he and his friends called it when they yodeled like mountaineers in the locker room, the bump on their throats jiggling up and down, the sound of echoing off the walls, along with their laughter and banter. Here, though, the voices called it a larynx. He couldn't move it, and it hurt. And because he couldn't move his head, he had to look at his new self in the mirror above him. His head lay on a smooth aluminum tray, a folded towel for a pillow. His pale skin and flattened hair repelled him. The collar around his neck chafed his skin. How long had he been like this? It seemed like only a day or two since he and Paul had been playing hockey on the street. At any other time, he would have recorded in his diary how new experiences made him feel, so he would remember them. Now, he wanted to forget everything. He tried to interrupt the machine again, and again he failed. He swallowed hard, casting his thoughts about for another way to defeat it. He could feel the buildup of mucus in his throat. Maybe, he decided, he wouldn't cough. The tube would fill up, blocking the unwanted air from slipping in. Then he and his sorrow could drown together silently. He decided to keep still and let it happen. He was hidden by the white cloth screen the voices had placed around his machine, but forgotten to remove when they'd last worked on him. Now was his chance. The screen would hide the twisted expression on his face. He hoped the noise of all the other machines in the room would conceal any sounds he made. But his cough reflex kicked in and he choked loudly. From out of nowhere, the screen was whisked away. Two hands appeared above him, slipping a narrow hose into the tube in his throat, suctioning up the guck. The hands cleaned up the edges of the tube with a washcloth. Without making eye contact, the person behind the white mask used a hand to give Dale's hair a brief pat. There, a woman's voice behind the mask pronounced, "All better now." The hands and the faceless being disappeared. The air came back, fresher than before. High above him, the white ceiling was his sky. He tried to sigh, but the iron lung deprived him of even a moment's personal despair. In and out, evenly, unrelentingly. Again, the mirror reflected his unhappy face. "Mom," he tried to call out, but his voice came out as a gurgle. How could he die if everything and everyone was trying to keep him alive?
Chapter 1. Dr. Lagace-Wiens, this polio epidemic that swept across North America and made itself really evident here in Manitoba and in Winnipeg, where did it come from?
Oh, I mean, polio is a virus that's been around for a very long time, and it just comes in waves, much like other epidemic waves, when there is sufficient people who are out there that haven't been exposed in a long time. And then the virus makes an appearance, whether it's through travel, whether it's through introduction by somebody who's a carrier. Polio is a virus that is spread in water. So, and you know, what struck me about this book is it highlighted how inequity, you know, in Rooster Town, no sewers, no running water, it thrives in those conditions. So as soon as you've got those conditions that meet together, you will have epidemics. Infectious diseases love social inequality because that's where they spread best. So you had a situation, you have high population density in some areas, you had introduction of the virus, and it spread in the summertime because kids played in water. And that's what they did. And we always saw these outbreaks affecting these communities that were underserviced, that had social inequalities, and of course the richer communities who had running water and such did not suffer that much. And you know, it struck me with COVID, and I'm sorry to bring up COVID-19, is because it really struck me when I read the chapter summaries. The same thing happened again 70 years later. That who is suffering with COVID? It's for the most part not us people who have you know, reasonable amount of wealth, access to vaccine, access to healthcare. It's the same inequity that I'm seeing again. And so epidemics work that way. They seem to really favor inequality. So if I were to answer that question, I don't think we know where specifically it came from. Was it a traveler who came in and brought it into North America at some point? Possibly. But if you get right down to the root, where did it come from? Epidemics come from inequality. And that's really it.
Why did so many children contract it?
Well, partly because adults at some point in their lives may have been exposed and so had immunity from it. And so you get a whole new cohort of children. You had a large number of children, of course, because the baby boom had happened and there was a lot of kids out there. So a lot of susceptible hosts who had never been exposed to it. And also it spreads during activities that children tend to do, the swimming in water, the running around, the getting close together. And so children were more susceptible to it because they were exposed to the virus in its niche in the water and exposed to each other in a very close way, much like other infections transmit between children.
What led to the death of people infected with polio? How did it affect them physiologically that led to their death?
Well, largely the virus infects parts of the spinal cord that allow you to move your muscles. And what that really does in the end is it paralyzes in a small percentage of people. So not all kids who got polio got paralytic polio. But a small percentage of kids would have the muscles of their breathing muscle, the diaphragm, affected, and they could no longer breathe on their own. At that point, they would either die, and there's no doubt that deaths happened at home, where not everybody had access to a polio hospital or an iron lung. So again, about inequality. And at that point, you would require ventilation. You needed a machine to breathe for you until there's some recovery that happened. Many children did recover. Many children cleared the infection, their nervous system recovered, their breathing muscles recovered, and they were eventually able to go back home with some deficits for the most part. Much like COVID, we have people who are severely ill, they go home. Sure, they go home, but they've got major deficits, possibly for the rest of their life. And you mentioned post-polio syndrome, and the neurological problems with post-polio syndrome haunted people for the rest of their lives. Neurological problems, motor control problems, and eventually they ended up having problems with breathing and ended up being ventilated. And what killed these children who did manage to get to the iron lungs is infections. So you can be on an iron lung forever, but you will get recurring infections because you can't clear your secretions. As you know, the first chapter was perfect. It really described the experience that these kids would have had with all these secretions that came out, and if you didn't suction them, they blocked things, you got pneumonia, and then kids in these hospitals died of those complications.
Can I ask those of you who are here in the room to raise your hands if polio touched your family?
Wow, that floors me.
Wow. So what is it? I mean, I had heard of iron lungs for a very long time. I had no idea really what they were. What did iron lungs do to help to keep polio victims alive? And why did they need this breathing apparatus?
Right, so I mentioned how the diaphragm became paralyzed by the virus and the nervous system wouldn't know how to make that diaphragm move up and down. And this is a muscle that all it does is moves up and down and up and down. And that's what allows us to reduce the pressure in our lungs, so air has to go in. So what an iron lung would do essentially is it would encase the whole person's body so that their hand was outside of it, and it would reduce the pressure in that chamber just like the diaphragm does. So it would pull down a mechanical diaphragm essentially to reduce the pressure in that cylinder so that you essentially were forced to suck air in. Now you could keep your mouth closed and your nose plugged and you wouldn't be able to suck air in, which is why they needed to put a hole right in your trachea so that you had no control over whether or not that air was going in and out. It was beautifully described in that first chapter. And of course, then because the air is going in and out below your vocal cords, you can't speak. You are unable to speak. So if you take a moment and imagine yourself, you woke up, you were a child, you were in this machine, you couldn't speak, this thing was breathing for you, and you're choking in your own secretions every hour or so, and you needed somebody to help you. Devastating disease. And polio was a very visible disease. You know, not everybody, as I said, got paralytic polio, but it was a very visible disease. Hospitals were coming up to help these kids. Everybody at the time knew a kid that had polio and had consequences.
Darrell, I know that your dad is here with you tonight, and that was wonderful of him to come along, but the book is set in 1955. The expulsion and demolition of Rooster Town happened in 1960. What do you know about exposure to polio that happened among people who were living in Rooster Town in the mid-50s?
Unfortunately, very little, but I did talk to my dad about it, and he does recall the epidemic back in when it came into Winnipeg, and that's pretty well all he shared with me. Nobody in our family that I know had suffered from polio at that time. Oh, my dad.
Okay, Mr. Sais.
I like let everybody know, nobody in Rooster Town had polio.
So Dad is saying that nobody in Rooster Town had polio.
Yeah, so I guess I did some reading too on polio, and part of it, because I watched the Tobey Maguire movie about it, where he got polio, and I did some research and with the book too, and from my understanding is breastfeeding for women wasn't as predominant back then, where it would be in Rooster Town because they couldn't afford to get Inflac or whatever they had at that point.
Yeah, and that would protect, and again, mentioning how adults don't get polio because they've been exposed to it in their childhood and became immune, and the women would have antibodies that they would give to their children. And breastfeeding is an important way to get those antibodies in.
Yeah, one of the characters that Dale meets in the hospital, was that the King George Hospital, Harriet would have been? Yeah. The now since demolished, it's now Riverview, but King George Hospital was the hospital. But he met this girl that he really liked, Charlene Arcand. Why did you choose her?
Well, I was casting about like who should he meet. I wanted to have a relationship, a boy-girl relationship in this, and so I was casting about. At one point, I thought maybe he should meet a violin player because I played violin when I was in grade 7, 8. I thought maybe I could do that. Then I was reading, like what you do to is you're reading the newspapers at the time. I was looking online at the Winnipeg Tribune and the Winnipeg Free Press at the time. And there were these very pejorative articles about the people who lived in Rooster Town, and I realized that this is the period of time when the pressure was starting. Developers wanted this section of land; they wanted to build, and they were starting to agitate with City Hall. Try to get city councillors on their side, and to get this land, and people were starting to be pressured and offered money, or trying to be convinced to leave. And so I thought this was the perfect time to raise a very important issue in our society, which is the question of racism. And one of the people I consulted about who got polio was Dr. Morley Lertzman, who was the youngest medical student in his class and worked as an orderly at the King George Hospital. One day he would work as a doc in the emergency, and the next day he would do orderly duties. And so I talked to him and I said, who got polio? Because in some ways, there were disadvantaged communities. There were some stories about some disadvantaged communities where terrible things happened. But in other ways, because of lack of breastfeeding was reduced and all this, there was a lot of middle class kids who got it because they were playing together, So I said, well, who got polio? Because and the other thing is that the middle class kids wrote the memoirs. It's very interesting who they are. So So that was interesting. Anyway, he said everybody got polio. It didn't matter what strata, what area of society you came from, you were susceptible. If you had all these different conditions, you know, you didn't have the antibodies for these various different reasons, you were susceptible. So I thought, well, there's an opportunity to talk about what was going on in our social issue in our society.
So Darrell, when your family, your father's family, was expelled from Rooster Town and it was demolished and all this was built, what happened to the Sais family? Where did everybody go?
Well, I asked my dad about this because growing up, he told me many stories of Rooster Town. He was very proud of the community. And initially, my dad said that his father wanted to move back to St. Norbert because that's where the Sais came when they came to Red River Settlement. They ended up settling in St. Norbert, but my grandmother, no, she wanted to go live where her twin sister lived, and that was in the North End. So they moved back over to the North End, and that's where most of us were born and raised.
How did their circumstances change when they were forced out of Rooster Town?
Well, from my stories from my dad is the biggest thing that changed is they did not own their home and they did not own their land anymore. They're actually, they were fortunate to find a place in the North End. But what happened was the real estate agent kind of swindled them out where they forgot to tell them that there was $4,000 worth of taxes left on the home, and they ended up just losing their home again. So, and then after that, they were just living from home to home for a while.
Darrell, at one point in the book, one of the boys taunts Charlene, the girl, Charlene Arcand, by calling her a half-breed. What did you think when you read that?
Again, with my dad, that's pretty well what they would say was, he didn't like the word half-breed because he was Métis. Métis he said Métis is French and indigenous, and half-breed would be Scottish so my father didn't like the word half-breed. He liked the word Métis. Right, Dad?
Right.
And the people of the community didn't necessarily call it Rooster Town, they called it Pecan Town, right?
Yes, Pecan Town, because there's hazelnut store all over the place, my dad said.
I still want to know who named that place Rooster Town.
So the dad wants to know who named the place Rooster Town. That's the big question, right?
Don't know, Dad.
Nobody can answer me.
Now, there's a lot of technical information in the book, Harriet, a great deal that was really illuminating. When we talked about iron lungs, but what's a rocking bed?
Well, a rocking bed is another device to force the diaphragm to work. And so it was less constricting in some ways, but you were put on this bed and they set the rate of how many times it went back and forth. You went down and up, and it was mechanical. Your diaphragm was just forced to squeeze and release, squeeze and release. And so people I've talked to who were on rocking beds say, I spoke with part of Dale, the character. His mother was on a rocking bed for, like, that's what she did all day. It would be on a rocking bed, at home. When she was released, she had an iron lung and a rocking bed, and it was just another way to, with less of a claustrophobic feeling, to have your body mechanically active. And I suppose it was good for your circulation and other things too.
Now, I have another question. I was at the convention center the other day getting my flu shot, and I got talking to the nurse who was helping me. And I was mentioning that you and I were going to be talking, and Darrell and Dr. Lagace-Wiens were going to be talking about polio. And he said, I used to work at the King George Hospital with a lot of post-polio patients. And I said to him, you mentioned in the book about frog breathing.
Yeah.
And I said, do you know what that is? And he demonstrated it for me.
Mm-hmm.
What's frog breathing?
Well, frog breathing is they had to gasp every breath. They had to throw their heads up and position their trachea open and pull the air in and then expel it. And it's every single breath. When they were outside the device or without a respirator, had to be achieved otherwise you died. And when I interviewed Paul Alexander, a man whose has a character named after him, he has been in an iron lung since 1952, and he said he talked about that. When I interviewed him recently, he just talked about how you struggle. He has for every single breath for the rest of your life in that situation.
Now, I watched that video that you had posted in the conversation you had with him, and you put it up on Facebook. For those who haven't seen it yet, it's an astonishing thing to see. He's 75 now, and he's been in an iron lung since he was 5 years old.
6, yeah, and like for some decades or a period of time, he was able to get out and use other assistants. He became a lawyer. He's had a very busy life, but finally now he's not able to. He needs assistance all the time.
But he's named for one of the characters in the book.
And what I did was I gave I gave every character a second chance. And Paul Alexander does not get polio. And
Alexander the Great, as you call it in the book.
Yeah,
right?
He does not get polio, and he has a different possibility in life than that he should have, the right kind of possibility.
But there is a Dr. Barsky in the book.
There is a Dr. Barsky, because I thought, Mindy gave me that inspiration, and so and he was such a, everyone you speak to who, my husband's physician, he was my husband's physician. Everybody,
Dr. Barsky was Cease's physician?
Everybody. If you didn't have one, my dog, when I went, Dr. Berger, that I had, it was Dr. Barsky. But, and everybody spoke so nicely of him, so I thought it was only suitable that he should be represented.
And the children were treated with these warm wool, water-soaked
hot.
And what were they called?
Well, they were called hot foments, and it's interesting. I often wondered. Foments, yes. And it's interesting. I sometimes wondered about that word and where it came from. And the person who originated that treatment was Sister Elizabeth Kenny, an Australian bush nurse. And she's an interesting character, a person with very great personality. No one is actually sure she actually was a nurse, but she figured out, she was in the bush and was treating someone with polio. And she decided to use this hot wool, because that's what they had in the outback. And she wrapped mussels with it. And it was a completely contrary treatment to what was standard at the time. The standard treatment at the time was to constrict the limbs, to cast you or to put you in braces. And that resulted in atrophy and just disintegration of the person's possibility of recovery, really. Anyway, she did battle, apparently, with the Australian medical system by suggesting that the muscles needed to be relaxed. Now, she had this idea that they were, she had some idea about the neurology, that they were in spasm in an unusual way. But so she developed this idea to put hot foments, and then they would start to cool off, and then you would massage the muscles. And there was some value in it, except it sort of went to the extreme. Anyway, her ideas were adopted by the Americans. She met Roosevelt, and there was an Elizabeth Kenny Institute in Minneapolis, and a few other of them. She came to Winnipeg to teach her treatment, and that was adopted in North America. So it was overkill in the sense of you didn't have to boil the children's skin, because apparently it was, administered very sort of brutally sometimes. It was too hot for the orderly or whoever was putting it on to handle, but they would put it on the kids. But the idea of retraining the muscles had some value, of massage, and because the muscles would become twisted, and it's difficult.
Dr. Lagasse-Wiens, how long did it take Jonas Salk to develop this vaccine? I know there's been a lot of talk now about whether the COVID-19 vaccines have been expedited too rapidly.
I'm not sure. You might actually know.
About 6 years. Like they had been doing other research. For instance, why was there no flu epidemic after Second World War? Because that's what they focused on in the Second World War, was to get everybody vaccinated before they came back. Anyway, the work that devolved from that grew into the polio research. And so it's, I would say 1949 is when the serious, real intense work started, and it was funded by the March of Dimes in the United States. They had this childhood polio foundation, and really intense funding, and they worked hugely quickly.
Yeah, and I think vaccine science has been evolving, well, technically since I suppose 1799, when Jenner first poked somebody with cowpox instead of smallpox and protected them from smallpox. But yeah, just to bring it back, because a lot of people do have anxiety about COVID-19 vaccines, and how is it that we only took a year and a half to make this vaccine? Science has been building on itself for decades now, and we understand the immune system better than we ever have. So there is nothing, mysterious about making a vaccine that quickly, not in my view. And it's been building on that kind of science for decades. So sure, it took 6 years. I didn't know that. They don't even teach polio in my medical school anymore, other than vaccinating for it. But it took 6 years back then is almost irrelevant to how long it should take to make a vaccine today.
And there was a second vaccine, the Sabin.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And was that a vaccine too?
Yeah, it's the difference is that the sorry.
No, go ahead.
Oh, the Salk vaccine is made from dead virus, and the Sabin vaccine is made from live virus. So people our age would have gotten both vaccines. The Sabin vaccine was finally finished in 1962, and it's you drank it or you had a drop on a sugar cube, but it's from live virus. And so the advantage of the Sabin vaccine is that it's cheaper to produce and easier to transport and all this, and it doesn't require special equipment. But the disadvantage is that in rare cases it caught polio because it's got live virus in it. It can give people polio. So they had rare cases. So at first they were so convinced by it because of the efficacy that they abandoned the Salk vaccine. But by 1989 or 1999, I can't remember, they abandoned the Sabin vaccine in North America. I think it's still used somewhere in other places.
There are a handful of countries that are still using oral polio vaccine just because of the transportability.
That's it. Yeah. But the more reliable one is the Salk vaccine. Now, at first, the Salk vaccine had to be given in 3 needles, and so that's another reason why they abandoned it, because the Sabin was just one dose.
There's a point in the book when you bring up the issue of vaccine resistance. What was it? Dale's father was someone who was opposed to didn't like doctors and was opposed to the idea of the children getting shots. And it turned out to create a problem with the kids, right? With Brent, the brother.
Right. Well, there was vaccine resistance at the time too. And a few of the people whose information I found about were, one of them who he made his own medicines and sold them like via mail. He didn't believe in any medical system, and he announced that the polio was a result of bad nutrition, and there were a few others who had their versions. This fellow made a lot of money selling prescriptions that he created himself. But the key, a line that is similar to all of them, is that they were all, as well as being anti-medical system, were all racists and white supremacist. They were anti-Jew, they were anti-Black, and at the time, because of the legacy of the World War II, they were anti-Japanese, and their brochures and screeds and statements were consistently just horrible. And some of them claimed that if you were taking the polio vaccine, you were getting the blood, you might be getting the blood of these alien races injected into you. So it draws a lot of parallels to today's the unity that anti-vaxxer and these white supremacist and anti-government and other kinds of people have found in the opposition to the vaccine.
Well, there was an equivalent of Rush Limbaugh back then,
Yes.
right? Walter Winchell,
yeah,
right?
That's right. And Walter Winchell took it up. That's right. He had this 15-minute radio show, and if you go online or on YouTube, something, he had this machine gun delivery. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Like this. And one thing that was happening with Walter Winchell at the time, he was a gossip columnist in the 30s and 40s and things like this. But with the advent of television, his career was, and he was getting older, he was losing audience, right? And radio was not as popular. And so he took up this myth that this one of these characters was propagating, is that the American government was stockpiling little white coffins because children, and there were trials going on, and there were huge trials going on for the polio vaccine, that they were stockpiling white coffins because little children were dying, who just weren't being told about it. And so
History repeats
and it
itself.
it caused a huge panic in society. People whose children were in the trials withdrew them, and because of that, it caused huge panic. And then the polio research was affected, like they had to justify themselves and things like this. So,
Darrell, I was out to the giant kettle out on the transit line with you and your family actually last summer, and some of it had to do with water delivery in Rooster Town. And there's a scene in the book where Dale goes to visit Rooster Town and he thinks that maybe he can find Charlene's family. And he gets talking to a guy who's delivering water. Was that your family delivering the water?
Well, that's my grandfather started that, and then my father took over. So entrepreneur Frank Sais is there. So it was just, from my understanding, what my dad's story was, it's just people that didn't have access to the water because it was a pump at Grant and Cambridge, and some of the elderly people and people that just didn't have the tools available, they had a horse and a wagon, so they go around and they would get people water. So I think it was 10 cents of what, Dad?
35 cents a barrel.
35 cents a barrel.
See, still remembers. 75.
Was there really this gigantic telegram assembled for
Yes,
Jonas Salk?
yeah, in Winnipeg they sent it. Yeah.
And it was like what? How long was it?
It was about near 75 or 85 yards long or something like that. And it just said, "We love you, Dr. Salk," apparently. Yeah. Yeah, so like people were so grateful, like in all the books I read, the memoirs, like people wept that they peeled bells, and the headlines were massive. Like this was, just to quote Dale Leach, like people at the end of a conversation, and when I was speaking with them, they just unbidden, they would say, "Dr. Salk saved us. He saved us from further tragedy. He saved society." Like they lived in terror. Parents lived in terror. Children lived in confusion. They couldn't live their lives. It's this, same restrictions and the unknown, and he saved them. And so the level of appreciation was overwhelming.
I was doing some research over the last few days about Jonas Salk, and there was a comparison to Anthony Fauci. But the allegations at the time were Salk's getting fantastically wealthy. He's a billionaire, which wasn't true.
No, he didn't.
And Anthony Fauci isn't a billionaire either. He gets paid a regular salary, but he didn't get wealthy in the way that the nasty people are out there circulating rumors.
No,
right?
not at all. And there's it's. I think that when people say that they're opposed, they have these gurus or these heroes of the anti-vaccination movement. These people are making a ton of money with on their lectures or their phony cures or things like this, or their. It's really disinformation. It's malicious, and it's. Dr. Salk did not patent gain personally. He remained a scientist, and certainly elevated his stature, and he started the Jonas Salk Institute in San Diego, which continued to do and continues to do, and has produced Nobel Prize winners on infectious diseases and science. And but he did not benefit. He did not patent he said, "How can you patent the sun?"
So moving now into contemporary times, Dr. Lagace-Wiens, I'm curious, when you look at the big picture, what lessons we learned from polio and COVID and have not learned from polio and COVID?
Well, I think I hinted at one right at the beginning, one lesson we haven't learned, and it's a lesson infectious diseases teaches us all the time, whether it's tuberculosis or whether it's typhoid or whether it's COVID-19 or influenza, is inequality. Infectious diseases thrive in inequality, and until we can equalize ourselves, we will never be rid, even imagine of having a reduced prevalence of infectious diseases, and that's HIV and that's hepatitis B. You name one infectious diseases and it's always all about inequality. So that's obviously something we haven't learned. What we have learned, I think, is for a greater, I hope for a greater number of people, we have learned to have faith in vaccines. We have learned that there are people who do have unfounded beliefs that allow us to, shed doubt on the science of vaccines and the belief that vaccines really do work, but they do. And I think all of us probably, I hope there's not too many anti-vaxxers in this crowd, but there might be. And we need to continue pushing that vaccines save lives. Vaccines, you always hear, well, vaccines do this, vaccines do that, vaccines cause this, vaccines really cause one thing, they cause adults. Vaccines cause adults. And I think it was really the polio vaccine that pushed that made people realize, imagine being a mother in July or August and your child spikes a fever and you know what that means in August. We still know what that means. It's an enterovirus now, it's not polio, but it still means that child probably had polio. And now you've got a chance that child will never walk again or possibly even die. So vaccines really, I think people grew in their belief of vaccines through the polio epidemics that we experienced. And that's a legacy we did well at, obviously. What else have we learned and what else have we failed to learn? I think a lot of us, unfortunately, have failed to learn that there are snake oil salesmen and there will continue to be snake oil salesmen. There will be Joe Rogans in the future and there are Joe Rogans now. And if we really look at it, you have to see the difference. You've got a guy who's got a YouTube channel and he's just making a bucket load of money just to be controversial. And you've got Dr. Salk, who never wanted to have a dime out of this. And he got fame out of it. There's no doubt about that, but he didn't make much money. So one thing we need to continue learning is to doubt people who are really out there to make a fast buck. And that's, we need to continue to learn to trust the experts. I think me as an expert, the healthcare field as experts have really taken a major hit from people who have called them all sorts of names. There is not a day that goes by that I don't get insulted. There's not a day that goes by that I don't open my email box and see a threat.
Are you serious?
I am serious. And they're not like, I'm going to kill you threats. They're kind of veiled threats. You'll end up going to hell for vaccinating children, or you're an awful doctor, or remember Nuremberg. That's a common recurrent theme. Oh yeah, every day I get maybe not every day, but certainly multiple times a week I get a message like that. So clearly things have not changed in that regard. So we really need to work with these people. And I don't want to abandon these people. I think that's an important point that I want to bring. If people are anti-vax, I will respect your views, but I will try to change them. There's no doubt about that.
There may be people in the room here tonight who are having their surgeries delayed because the hospitals are full of people with COVID. And as we know now, what the data tells us is that most of the people with COVID now are unvaccinated people. And so what sense do you make of the kind of vaccine resistance we're seeing and its impact across the larger society?
Well, I think every day we see the impact that vaccine hesitancy and anti-vax movements have had. And I think the biggest tragedy, and you've pointed it out here, is we'll get out of this. And, I wish I had a crystal ball to tell you when, but it's actually, we're getting close. Sadly, enough of these unvaccinated people are eventually going to get COVID that they'll have some degree of immunity, and that's a real tragedy, that some of them will die because of that. But the bigger tragedy that I'm facing down right now is that we're actually going to deal with a longer pandemic because of the vaccine hesitancy. And it's not going to be just a longer pandemic of COVID-19. It's going to be a longer pandemic of cancers. It's going to be a longer pandemic of heart disease. We're only just getting over that infectious part of the pandemic, and now we need to deal with all of those repercussions, which are still part of the pandemic. All those people who are going to have heart attacks and not survive.
Caused by the virus?
No, well, no, caused by the fact that all these surgeries and
Oh, by
diagnostic
delay,
procedures have
yeah.
been delayed. And so these cancers are not getting diagnosed as early as they could have been because their colonoscopy got delayed by 8 months. And that's the legacy of a pandemic. And it's also a legacy of the anti-vaccine movement, because if we had gotten those vaccine rates high enough, it would have aborted those. And we're seeing it right now. We're seeing it in Winnipeg with a vaccine uptake rate that's much higher than a lot of the rest of Manitoba, and certainly very much higher than the South. Where are all our cases coming from? They're all coming from areas that are, not all, but the vast majority are coming from under-vaxxed areas. And we're seeing our hospitals fill up with those people who are under-vaccinated or unvaccinated. And we will continue to see that legacy for years and years to come because of these delays that a very tenuous healthcare system was not able to cope with.
What evidence do you see of healthcare workers suffering because of COVID, either from stress or from actually catching it?
Well, catching it is an obvious stress. You can get ill yourself. We've had doctors that have to be admitted to hospital. We've had nurses that have died of COVID-19. You guys may have heard about that. And that was actually a legacy of vaccine hesitancy. This poor woman had heard that she could become infertile if she had this vaccine, and was offered it, denied it, and then got COVID and died. But so those are some personal stories. They're not the majority, obviously. But we've had nurses walk out. We've had nurses quit from providing COVID care so that they could go to agencies where their hours would be better. They wouldn't be forced to have overtime. We've had doctors who have been overwhelmed by depression and can no longer work. We've had doctors that have had their own health decline because of this. Their heart disease or their various other medical problems have declined due to inability to either access care or because of the stress that the pandemic has caused. Every day, and it's not just the front line. A lot of my work is in the lab, and we've seen technologists walk out because they can't deal with it. We've gone from a 16-hour-a-day lab to a 24-hour-a-day lab just to provide the diagnostic services that the system needs. And we've had people literally, they're done. I'm 55. Why would I keep putting up with this and not just retire when I'm only working for the difference between my pension and my salary, which is almost nothing? But they love their jobs, and that's why they were there beyond their pensionable time. They loved it, and now they don't anymore. And that applies right across the board. And then we already started with a deficit in nursing staff and a deficit in lab staff. And now it's undermined even more. And it's going to cost a lot. It's going to cost us in the long run enormously. And you can't patch it by saying, oh, well, we'll get student nurses to come. When you get all of your most experienced nurses to leave, who's going to teach those student nurses? So this is snowballing into a really horrific healthcare nightmare for those of us who are left there trying to pull the pieces together. And at the same time, you've got surgeons who really want to help. They really want to do these procedures, but they can't because they got no nurses. They're shoved back into the COVID wards. So it is a tragedy that's unfolding, and I hate to say it, it's a tragedy that's going to continue to affect us for years and years with all the delays that have occurred because of it.
Now, you've heard so much tonight, and John mentioned at the beginning that we have an opportunity now for you to ask questions or make comments.
I'm afraid we are at the top of the hour.
And so do we have time for one question?
We do have one question from the internet. If we want to.
Do we? Okay, let's hear it.
That's fair.
Great, and this is a very open question to Harriet, which is just what attracts you to the social justice issues that you write about?
That's me. That's me. I do. I am an oppositional person. I'm very. I've always been interested in social justice, and inequality has always bothered me.
Darrell, final thoughts from you tonight about what you've read or what you've heard tonight?
I really enjoyed the book. I was telling Harriet, I go read a couple of chapters today, but I ended up reading more and more. I got more interested in it. Really piqued my interest, obviously, when you mentioned the Rooster Town and that, and how that was. It was very enjoyable, and so my daughter wants to read the book now, which is good. The only thing I really like to add is to really understand what happened to the people of Rooster Town is, and it took me a while to figure this out, is My grandmother never had a home after leaving here. She went from house to house, but she didn't have a home. And to see her living in poverty was horrible. And just to have it taken away, no other reason than just because you're an Indian is just totally wrong. I don't think they realize what they did to these families. I was the next generation that actually was able to own a home. Okay, so it's something that was very wrong, but unfortunately it still happens today in other ways too. But I really appreciate Harriet for this book. I really found it very interesting. Thank you for reaching out to us. We really enjoyed it. My dad was a little reluctant to talk too much because he doesn't trust people too much, especially if you ever have a chance, what Harriet said, you read the old newspapers, what they said about the people of Rooster Town was horrible and it wasn't true. Again, thank you so much, Harriet.
And Darrell, thanks to you too, because remember last fall, I created an episode of the Prairie Design Lab podcast with you, exploring the meaning of Rooster Town and what happened, and with the city planners and the landscape architects, and a kind of deep look at what they tried to fix with the Bill and Helen Norrie Library, but also hearing from you, and you're helping us to understand what happened in Rooster Town.
Yeah, thank you.
And Dr. Lagace-Wiens, a final word from you?
Yeah, I mean, I think I didn't actually get the chance to read the book. I got the chapter notes and kind of brought it in at the last minute here, but I've read them and I felt much like when I first heard about smallpox vaccine hesitancy. It's a gut punch to a doctor to be told, don't get vaccinated. I know what's right, by people who don't otherwise know. And I do believe I know the cause, or the root cause of these disbelief issues is there's a lot of scientific literacy that we're not teaching our kids. They don't understand what viruses are. They don't understand what the immune system is. And the school systems, as good as they are, and I love the public school system, they don't have the time to teach them. So if I had one last passing thought is, as parents, as grandparents, teach your kids about these things. Teach your kids about infectious diseases. They're going to affect them at one point in their life, and they need to understand how your body works. And it doesn't have to be just infectious diseases. How your body works is such an important thing you can teach people, and it will give them health for a lifetime. And that's really something that struck me about this is vaccine hesitancy comes from not understanding how things work. And so if we can teach our kids that and our grandkids that, our next generation will be better than the last one.
Well, thanks so much. And thanks to my three guests, and Harriet, thanks to you for such a vivid and detailed account, and it's so compelling, and it's great storytelling. It really is. And thank you for coming out tonight. So enjoy the book.
Yes, indeed. Thank you all so very much for your attention. To all the folks watching online, thank you for your kind comments as well. We'll now be moving along to the signing portion of the evening. So we'll ask you all just to remain in place for one moment while we move Harriet to a table, which is just beyond the cash desk. After that point, we'll alert you when it's time to come and join her. And you may all join us at the table to get a copy of the book signed. If you aren't able to stay for the signing, Harriet has very kindly signed some copies of the book in advance, and those are available. Sorry, I'm just going to turn off the microphones beside me. And so signed copies of the book are available at the central cash desk. We also have copies there as well that you can purchase. If you have a copy in hand and haven't bought it yet, please do feel free to get into the signing line. All we ask is that you do please remember to pay for the book at some point before you actually enter. We'd like to express our sincere gratitude to Red Deer Press and Fitzhenry and Whiteside for helping to make this event a possibility, to Terry MacLeod for his inimitable hosting of the event as well. To our wonderful panelists, Darrell Sais, Dr. Philippe Lagace-Wiens, and of course, please join me one final time in acknowledging the work of Harriet Zaidman.